The air in the room is thick, sweet, and heavy. It smells of crushed roses and expensive death. You are a guest of the emperor. You sit on a couch of carved ivory, surrounded by the most powerful men in the world. You expect a feast of nightingale tongues and vintage wine. What you get is a silence that feels like a weight. Then, a soft click from above. The ceiling panels slide open, and for a heartbeat, you think it is a blessing. A rain of pink and white flower petals drifts down, soft as a lover's touch. But the rain does not stop. The petals become a flood. The flood becomes an avalanche. Within seconds, the room is a swirling, suffocating ocean of perfume. You try to stand, but the weight of 1,000,000 blossoms pins you to your seat. You open your mouth to scream, and your lungs fill with pollen instead of air. High above the chaos, leaning against a marble railing, a teenage boy is laughing so hard he has to wipe his eyes. To him, your struggle is not a tragedy. It is the perfect setup for a joke that only a god could understand. The transition from a luxury dinner to a mass grave happens so slowly that the guests don't even realize they are dying until it is too late. In the Roman mind, death was supposed to be a matter of iron and blood. It happened on the battlefield under a screaming sky, or in the grit of the arena floor. It was loud. It was visible. It followed a set of rules that every Roman understood. But the boy on the throne did not care for rules. He found them boring. The Banquet of the Petals was his masterpiece of psychological and physical terror. He invited the elite, the senators who had commanded legions, the lawyers who had built the framework of Western justice, and he treated them like dolls in a playhouse. As the petals began to cascade from the vents, the initial reaction was one of wonder. This was the kind of excess Rome was famous for. A bit of theater, a bit of magic. Then the level reached their knees, then their waists. The physics of a flower petal are deceptive. Individually, they are weightless. In a mass of millions, they behave like a fluid. They flow into the gaps between bodies. They pack themselves into the throat and nostrils. The more you struggle, the more you create pockets of vacuum that the petals instantly fill. The guests began to realize that they were not being executed. They were being smothered by beauty. Elagabalus watched from his high balcony, draped in silk that cost more than a frontier province. He wasn't looking at the suffering with anger or hatred. He was looking at it with the detached curiosity of a child pulling the wings off a fly. He watched a decorated general, a man who had survived the Germanic forests, disappear beneath a drift of violets. He watched the silver goblets tip over, the wine mixing with the flowers to create a sticky, cloying mud. There was no honor in this death. That was the point. The Roman state was built on the idea of gravitas, dignity, weight, and seriousness. By killing the leaders of the state with flowers, Elagabalus was telling the world that their dignity meant nothing. He was mocking the very idea of Roman power. As the last gasps of air were replaced by the scent of roses, the emperor leaned over the railing and whispered a joke to his favorites. The bodies beneath the petals were still twitching, still fighting for one more hit of oxygen. But in the emperor's mind, they were already gone. They were just the punchline. When the servants finally cleared the room the next morning, they didn't find the bodies of heroes. They found men who had died in a state of absolute, humiliating confusion. The message was sent to every household in the city: the old world is dead. The law of the sword has been replaced by the whim of a child, and the child likes to play with his food. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. To the people of Rome, the physical world was only half of the story. The real strength of the empire lay in its pact with the gods. For over 1,000 years, that pact had been managed by a small, silent fire burning in the heart of the Forum. This was the flame of Vesta. It was more than a symbol, it was the city's pulse. If that fire ever went cold, the Romans believed their walls would crumble, their legions would break, and the sun would refuse to rise. The fire was tended by the Vestal virgins, women who existed outside the laws of men. They were the most sacred figures in the Western world. Even the fiercest emperors, men who had waded through blood to take the throne, had always stopped at the threshold of the temple of Vesta. They offered their respect. They bowed their heads. They understood that you do not touch the fire. Elagabalus did not just touch it. He tried to put it out. He arrived at the temple gates not with a sacrifice, but with a hammer. He sent his Syrian guards, men who did not speak the language of the Romans and did not fear their gods, into the sanctuary. They shoved past the priestesses, women who had lived in total seclusion for decades, and reached for the holy flame. They seized the Palladium, the ancient wooden statue of Minerva that was said to have been saved from the burning ruins of Troy. This was theological warfare. Elagabalus wasn't just moving furniture, he was evicting the Roman gods from their own home. He had the flame and the statue dragged up the Palatine Hill, into the shadow of his own palace. He placed them inside a new, gaudy temple built for his meteorite, the Black Stone of Emesa. By doing this, he was making a public statement. Rome's history was now a servant to his own whims. He declared that his god, Elagabal, was the greatest of the gods. All other deities, Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, were reduced to mere attendants. They were the help. He forced the senators to watch as their ancient relics were placed in a subordinate position to a piece of space debris. The city held its breath. They expected the ground to open up. They expected the sky to scream. But as the sun set over the forum that night, the sky remained a calm, indifferent blue. The silence of the gods was more terrifying than a thunderbolt would have been. It suggested that the gods had abandoned Rome, or worse, that they had never been there at all. Elagabalus stood in his new temple, smelling of frankincense and arrogance, and looked down at the sacred fire. He didn't see the heartbeat of a civilization. He saw a candle that he could blow out whenever he felt like a laugh. The spiritual spine of the empire had been snapped, and for the first time in history, the Roman people began to look at the horizon with genuine dread. The fire was still burning, but it no longer belonged to them. It belonged to a boy who treated the universe like a toy box. With the Roman gods silenced and the sacred fire relocated, Elagabalus moved to replace the identity of the city itself. He did not want to be a Roman emperor in the tradition of Augustus or Trajan. Those men were first citizens, servants of the law. Elagabalus saw himself as something far more ancient and far more terrifying. He was the earthly shadow of the sun. In the center of the Palatine Hill, he erected a monument to his god that dwarfed the ancient temples of the Republic. This was the Elagabalium. It was a place of gold, purple silk, and the heavy, intoxicating scents of the East. But there was no statue inside. There was only the meteorite, the black, conical stone that had fallen from the stars. To the Romans, who carved their gods into perfect human forms of marble and bronze, this was a grotesque absurdity. They worshipped beauty and order. This boy was asking them to worship a jagged rock that smelled of scorched earth. The rituals he performed there were a direct assault on the Roman psyche. Every morning, the emperor would emerge from the palace, his face painted like a mask, his body draped in gold-woven robes that trailed in the dust. He did not march. He danced. To the sound of drums and clashing cymbals, he would spin in circles around the black stone, his movements fluid and unsettling. He would slit the throats of dozens of bulls, sinking his hands into the warm blood and splashing it against the meteorite. The Senate was forced to stand in the heat and watch. These were men of war and law, men who believed in the stern, quiet dignity of the Roman way. Now, they were being told that their careers, their lives, and their fortunes depended on how well they could please a teenager who spent his afternoons dancing for a rock. Elagabalus began to demand that the entire city join his cult. He wasn't just a priest, he was a revolutionary. He ordered that the name of his god be mentioned before the name of Jupiter in every official prayer. He was trying to overwrite the memory of Rome, to turn the capital of the world into a private temple where he was the only voice that mattered. The wealth of the empire began to flow into the Elagabalus like a river. Grain that should have fed the poor was sold to buy exotic spices for the sun god's altar. Gold that should have paid the legions was melted down to plate the walls of the Black Stone's chamber. The people of Rome watched as their resources were consumed by a fire that didn't provide warmth, only shadow. The atmosphere in the city turned from confusion to a slow, simmering rage. The Romans were used to tyrants, but they weren't used to being made irrelevant. They realized that in the eyes of their emperor, they weren't even people. They were just scenery in a play that was becoming more violent and more strange with every sunrise. The black sun was rising, and beneath its light, the old Rome was starting to wither. As the months passed, the emperor's madness moved from the temples into the bedrooms and the banqueting halls. Elagabalus was no longer content with humiliating the gods. He wanted to humiliate the very concept of being a man. In Rome, masculinity was synonymous with the state. A man was a soldier, a father, a pillar of iron. Elagabalus decided to melt that iron. He began to offer massive rewards to his court physicians if they could perform the impossible. He stood before the greatest medical minds of the age and offered half the imperial treasury to anyone who could surgically alter his body to be that of a woman. The doctors stood in frozen terror. They knew that to try was to kill him, and to kill him was to face the slow agony of the cross. He was hunting for a boundary that nature would not let him cross, and his frustration turned into a lethal game of play acting. He opened the palace to the lowest levels of society. Chariot drivers, actors, and tavern brawlers were plucked from the streets and handed the keys to the empire. He appointed a stage dancer to command the Praetorian Guard, the most elite military unit in the world. He gave control of the city's grain supply to a man who had spent his life in the circus. These weren't just bad appointments, they were deliberate insults. He was telling the Senate that their 40 years of service was worth less than a dancer's smile. Then came the nights of the Great Reversal. At his dinner parties, he would force the most senior senators to dress in the clothing of female slaves and serve him at the table. He would watch as men who had governed entire nations were made to pour wine and scrub floors while he laughed from his couch. But the most famous and feared of his entertainments was the lottery of the couches. During the feast, servants would slip small wooden tokens under the cushions of the guests. These weren't for prizes, they were for survival. At the end of the night, you were forced to reveal your token. One man might win a bag of gold. The man sitting next to him might win a box of dead, rotting dogs that he was forced to take home. Another might find a token that simply read death. The psychological toll was devastating. You could not eat, you could not drink, and you could not leave. You sat in a room filled with the scent of expensive incense and the stench of hidden fear, waiting for a child to decide if you were a guest or a victim. The Roman elite began to realize that their empire was no longer a state. It was a private circus where the lions were hungry and the ringmaster was insane. The social order of 1,000 years had been flipped upside down, and the people at the bottom were beginning to realize that the person at the top was no longer human. The luxury of the palace was a cage, but the walls were starting to crack. Elagabalus had made the mistake that every falling tyrant eventually makes. He assumed that because he held the gold, he held the men. He forgot that the Roman Empire did not run on silk or incense. It ran on the cold, hard loyalty of the Praetorian Guard. These were not the soft senators he had humiliated at dinner. These were professional killers. They were men who had spent their lives in the mud of the frontier, sleeping with their swords and eating rations of hard bread. They had put Elagabalus on the throne because his grandmother, Julia Misa, had promised them a return to the glory days of pay raises and easy loot. But the god they had bought turned out to be a nightmare they couldn't control. The soldiers stood at the palace gates, forced to watch as their emperor danced in gold tiaras. They were forced to protect a man who spent the night selling his body in the city's dark corners and the day insulting the gods of their fathers. The shame was beginning to outweigh the silver. In the barracks, The whispers grew into a roar. They didn't see a divine Sun King anymore. They saw a liability that made them look like fools in front of the world. Julia Misa, the woman who had engineered this entire disaster, saw the change in the air. She was a political predator, and she could smell the scent of an impending massacre. She realized that if she didn't act, the Praetorians wouldn't just kill her grandson, they would slaughter her and the rest of the dynasty to wipe the stain clean. She pivoted. She began to focus the guards' attention on her other grandson, Alexander Severus. He was the shadow of Elagabalus, a boy who studied law, practiced with the sword, and spoke with the gravity of an old Roman. Misa began to leak a new narrative to the troops. The emperor is a mistake, but the cousin is the cure. The palace split into two camps. On one side was the emperor, surrounded by eunuchs and dancers, drowning in perfume. On the other was the young Alexander, backed by the iron of the legions and the silent calculation of his grandmother. Elagabalus, realizing he had been trapped, tried to strike back. He ordered his cousin's execution, but when his assassins reached the door, they found it blocked by a wall of Praetorian shields. The emperor, the man who claimed to be a god, suddenly realized he couldn't even give an order in his own hallway. The men with the swords were no longer listening. The power was shifting, not through a vote or a prayer, but through the silent, rhythmic sharpening of iron blades in the courtyard. The end was no longer a question of if, but a question of when. The end did not come with a grand battle or a heroic sacrifice. It came with the sound of thousands of iron-shod boots marching toward the palace. The Praetorian Guard had finally reached their breaking point. They weren't just coming to arrest a ruler, they were coming to prune a rot. On March 11th, 222 AD, Elagabalus attempted one last desperate performance. He brought his young cousin Alexander to the military camp, hoping that a public display of unity would soothe the soldiers' rage. He stood in the center of the courtyard, draped in his finest violet silks, and waited for the roar of loyalty. The silence that met him was like a physical blow. Then, a single voice shouted the name of Alexander. Then another. Within seconds, the entire camp was screaming for the boy who looked like a Roman, leaving the emperor standing in the dust like a discarded toy. Elagabalus lost his nerve. The living god turned and ran, his gold-woven robes catching at his heels as he fled from the very men he had once commanded. He didn't run to a temple. He didn't run to a fortress. He ran to a latrine. The master of the Roman world, a boy who had demanded his meals be dusted with gold and his baths filled with wine, was reduced to a rat. He scrambled down into the stone trench of the military toilets, crouched chest-deep in the raw sewage of his own soldiers. He smeared the waste across his face, praying that the darkness and the stench would hide him. His mother, the woman who had nurtured his every madness, crouched beside him in the filth, shaking with a terror that no silk could comfort. The soldiers didn't hurry. They followed the wet, panicked footprints through the dirt and stood over the holes in the stone bench. They looked down into the pit with the cold detachment of men cleaning a drain. There was no trial. There were no last words. They stepped down into the muck and drove their short swords through the mother first, then the son. The emperor who wanted to be a goddess died choking on the blood and the waste of his empire. But even death was not enough for Rome. The soldiers hauled the two corpses out of the pit, stripped them naked, and dragged them through the streets behind a chariot. The people who had watched his flower-petal banquets in silence now found their voices. They spat on the ruined body. They kicked at the ribs. They eventually reached the Tiber River and hurled the remains over the bridge, letting the brown water carry the sun god out to sea like common garbage. The Senate immediately passed the Damnatio Memoriae. Every statue was smashed. Every coin was melted. Every inscription of his name was chiseled away until the stone was blank. They wanted to believe that if they erased the name, they could erase the shame. But as the new 13-year-old emperor was wrapped in the purple, the lesson remained carved into the soul of the city. When a civilization trades its dignity for a show, It eventually finds itself looking for its gods in a saw. The era of the boy priest was over. The nightmare of Elagabalus was gone. But the shadow he left behind was a warning that would haunt the Empire until the day its last wall finally fell. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.